Before we step onto the fields of Gettysburg, pause for a moment. Imagine you're 23 years old, barely more than a boy, yet carrying the stars of a brigadier general on your shoulders. Your classmates from West Point are still lieutenants, struggling for recognition. And here you are commanding a brigade of cavalry in the middle of the largest battle ever fought on American soil. What would you do? Follow every order to the letter, or trust your instincts in the fire of battle? That's the story we're telling today. The tale of George Armstrong Custer, the boy general, and the charge he should never have made, the one that may have helped save Gettysburg. If you love diving into the untold stories of the Civil War, the forgotten decisions, the strange twists of fate, the young men and women who altered history with a single choice, make sure to subscribe to U.S. Civil War History. That one click helps us keep these stories alive and bring them to you every week. Now, let's ride back to the summer of 1863. George Armstrong Custer was not supposed to be a general, not yet. He graduated last in his West Point class, a cadet known for breaking rules more often than following them. He barely scraped by in mathematics and engineering, the very skills the academy prized. But what he lacked in discipline, he made up for in daring. He was bold, fearless, and carried himself with the kind of swagger that caught attention. By 1863, the Union Army needed men who could move fast and strike hard. Cavalry was no longer just scouts and skirmishers. It was becoming a decisive arm of battle. And in June of that year, General Alfred Pleasonton, desperate for aggressive leaders, promoted Custer from captain straight to brigadier general. Overnight, the boy who had once been mocked for his showmanship now commanded nearly 1,500 horsemen. Custer looked every bit the part of a romantic knight. He wore a black velvet jacket trimmed in gold, a red necktie that flowed in the wind, and let his long blonde hair cascade across his shoulders. Soldiers joked that he belonged more in a painting than on a battlefield. But there was no denying his energy. He rode at the head of his men, reckless, fearless, and loud, the kind of commander who inspired confidence simply by throwing himself into danger first. And Gettysburg would put that energy to the ultimate test. On July 3rd, as Robert E. Lee prepared his grand assault on the Union line, Custer's brigade found itself on the far right of the Union position, facing a Confederate cavalry force under none other than J.E.B. Stuart, the South's most celebrated horseman. What happened next would decide far more than Custer's reputation. It would help decide whether the Union line stood or fell. As the sun rose on July 3, 1863, the final day of Gettysburg, all eyes were fixed on the ridge lines west of town. Everyone knew Robert E. Lee was preparing one great, thunderous assault on the Union center. Artillery had already been massing since dawn, and the Confederate infantry under George Pickett would soon be marching across that deadly open field. But while the Union High Command braced for the storm ahead, a quieter threat was unfolding on the far right of their line. A threat almost no one noticed, until it was nearly too late. Confederate cavalry commander J.E.B. Stuart, flamboyant and fearless, much like Custer himself, had taken nearly 6,000 horsemen on a wide, sweeping arc around the Union flank. His mission was clear: strike the Union rear at the very moment Pickett's men slammed into the front. Think about that for a moment. Infantry attacking from the front, cavalry bursting through the rear. The Union line, pinned and crushed between hammer and anvil, might have shattered completely. Stuart's men weren't just horse soldiers with sabers. They carried carbines and pistols, enough firepower to wreak havoc on artillery batteries, wagon trains, and retreating infantry. If Stuart succeeded, chaos would ripple across the entire Union army. And in that chaos, Lee's gamble at Gettysburg might very well have paid off. But here's the irony. The Union High Command barely realized how dangerous this maneuver was. Cavalry, in their minds, still belonged on the edges of the battlefield, scouting roads or harassing supply trains. Few believed a mounted force could truly decide the outcome of a great battle. Yet on this day, cavalry would do exactly that. And waiting for Stuart's charge, whether by design or by accident, stood the youngest general in the Union Army, George Armstrong Custer. His Michigan Brigade had taken position along a stretch of open farmland, fences running like scars across the fields, and small patches of woods giving cover to riders on the move. It was here, on this seemingly quiet flank, that one of the fiercest cavalry clashes of the entire war would erupt. Custer knew Stuart was out there. He could feel it. The dust on the horizon, the scattered reports from scouts, the restless shifting of his own horsemen. They all told him something was coming. And when it came, he would face a choice that no 23-year-old should ever have to make. The fields east of Gettysburg had grown strangely quiet by mid-afternoon. The booming of artillery in the distance rolled like thunder, shaking the ground beneath the cavalry's hooves. Men shifted in their saddles, gripping reins tighter, waiting. They knew something was coming. Then, dust, a rising cloud on the horizon. Stuart's horsemen were here. Wave after wave of Confederate cavalry began to appear, columns stretching across the fields, sunlight flashing on drawn sabers. Nearly 6,000 troopers bore down on the Union flank, their shouts carrying in the hot summer air. They came on like a storm. Custer's orders were clear. Hold. Defend your position. Do not advance. He was supposed to delay Stuart's men, not meet them head-on. But as the first shots rang out and skirmishers scattered, the boy general made his choice. Custer rose in his stirrups, drew his saber, and shouted at the top of his lungs, words that would echo across history. "Come on, you Wolverines!" With that cry, he spurred his horse forward, golden hair flying, red necktie streaming behind him. And like a wave breaking loose, the 1st Michigan Cavalry surged after him, 400 strong. It was madness. 400 against thousands. Reckless, foolish, suicidal, some would later say. But the sheer shock of it, the audacity of that charge, hit Stuart's men like a hammer. Confederate cavalry reeled as Custer's Wolverines smashed into their front ranks, sabers flashing, pistols cracking at point-blank range. The two sides crashed together with the sound of splintering wood and tearing flesh. Horses screamed, men grappled in the saddle, blades clashed so violently that sparks flew. Clouds of black powder rolled low across the fields, choking rider and horse alike. Custer was everywhere, riding at the front, slashing, shouting, driving his men forward with fearless abandon. He seemed untouchable, as if luck itself rode at his side. His brigade, inspired by his fury, fought like demons. They did not scatter, did not fold. They drove their charge deep into Stuart's much larger force, buying precious minutes in a fight they should not have survived. Again and again, Stuart regrouped and pressed forward. Again and again, Custer hurled his Wolverines back at them. It wasn't careful strategy or refined tactics. It was raw instinct, audacity, and speed. And against all odds, it worked. By throwing away the rulebook, Custer had done what few thought possible. He had stalled the most feared cavalry commander of the Confederacy right on the edge of breaking through. But the fight was far from over. Stuart still had numbers on his side, and Custer's men could only charge so many times before exhaustion, blood, and death took their toll. The next clash would decide everything, whether the Union flank stood or whether Gettysburg would collapse in ruin. The fields east of Gettysburg became a storm of iron and dust. No neat lines, no careful maneuvers, only men and horses locked in a swirling chaos where survival was measured by a heartbeat. Custer's first charge had stunned Stuart's cavalry, but the Confederates quickly regrouped. Bugles sounded, officers bellowed, and like a dark tide, Stuart's men surged forward again, determined to crush the audacious boy general who dared to stand in their way. The ground shook under the pounding of thousands of hooves. Pistols cracked in rolling volleys, carbine fire ripped through the smoke, cutting down men before they could close with the enemy. And then, impact. Sabers rose and fell, clanging against steel, hacking through flesh. Riders grappled hand to hand, pistols fired point blank into faces. Men were dragged screaming from their saddles and trampled beneath the melee. Imagine that moment. The air thick with gunpowder, horses screaming in terror, men slashing in every direction, fighting not as orderly soldiers, but as desperate survivors. Cavalry battles are often remembered as gallant, romantic duels. But here, at Gettysburg, it was raw brutality. Custer, reckless as ever, drove his horse into the thickest fighting. Eyewitnesses later recalled his red necktie streaking like a banner through the smoke. He cut a path through enemy riders, shouting encouragement to his Wolverines, urging them forward as if sheer will could carry the day. His very presence, fearless and wild, seemed to give his men strength. But Stuart was no fool. He hurled fresh squadrons into the fray, determined to break the Union line with weight of numbers. For every Confederate rider forced back, another pressed forward. The Wolverines were being tested to the limit, surrounded on three sides, their lines bending under the pressure. And yet, they did not break. Union reinforcements began to arrive. Other cavalry brigades joined the fight, slamming into Stuart's flanks. Each fresh charge bought another minute, another heartbeat of resistance. The clash grew so violent that men later swore the sound of sabers striking steel echoed like church bells across the Pennsylvania farmland. The battle seesawed back and forth for nearly 2 hours, each side hurling charge after charge. Horses collapsed in exhaustion, their riders tumbling helplessly into the melee. Men fought on foot when mounts were shot from under them. Blood slicked the grass. Broken carbines and shattered sabers littered the field. Through it all, Custer never left the front. He fought with a ferocity that stunned even his own men. Young, reckless, impossibly brave, he seemed born for this moment of fury. And slowly, against all odds, the tide began to turn. By late afternoon, Stuart realized the truth. His thrust at the Union rear had failed. The boy general and his Wolverines had held him off. The hammer blow Lee had counted on never landed. Instead, the Union line stood firm, waiting for Pickett's charge, ready to meet the storm head-on. As the smoke cleared east of Gettysburg, the fields were littered with broken sabers, riderless horses, and the wounded cries of men who would never rise again. Stuart's cavalry, his great strike into the Union rear, had been stopped cold. The hammer and anvil Lee envisioned never fell. And at the heart of that stand was George Armstrong Custer, just 23 years old, reckless enough, or perhaps bold enough, to charge when orders told him to wait. His Wolverines had lost heavily, but they had held. Against the odds, against the numbers, they had fought Stuart to a standstill. Historians still debate what that moment meant. Some argue Stuart was too late, too disorganized, and that Custer's charge only hastened a fight the Confederates were bound to lose. Others insist that if Custer had obeyed his orders, Stuart would have smashed through the flank, and the story of Gettysburg might have ended in disaster. What no one disputes is this. On that July afternoon, the boy general carved his name into legend. In the span of hours, he went from a flashy, untested officer to the hero of the Union cavalry. His audacity had changed the course of the battle, and perhaps the war. Of course, Custer's story would not end here. The same reckless courage that saved Gettysburg would one day carry him to his death on the plains of Montana at the Little Bighorn. But for a brief, shining moment in 1863, he embodied the kind of wild, unrelenting gamble that sometimes, just sometimes, turns the tide of history. And that is why the tale of George Custer at Gettysburg still echoes today. A boy too young for his stars, too bold for his orders, yet just daring enough to save an army. If you've enjoyed this journey into one of Gettysburg's overlooked battles, consider subscribing to U.S. Civil War History. Here, we uncover the forgotten stories, the reckless gambles, and the human choices that shaped America's defining conflict. Your support helps us keep these voices alive, and there are many more untold tales still to come. Until next time, remember, history often turns not on certainty, but on the courage or the recklessness of those willing to charge headlong into the unknown.